previous lecture, I had been speaking to you about the wars of independence in Latin America, so we're going to continue with that. Started talking to you about you know, the demography in this part of the world, and I've been talking to you about, you know, who the Creoles are and the mestizos and the mulattoes, and that's really the point at which I had stopped there. So I'm going to take another, you know, 15-20 minutes. Perhaps slightly longer, to go through the history of Latin America in roughly early part of the 19th century, the wars of independence, which are about 1810 to 1830, and then move on to North America, in particular to the American Civil War, which is of course preceded by the Mexican-American War of 1846-48 and American expansionism, which eventually then paves the way for the American Civil War. And once again, I want to reiterate, I'm going to do that at every juncture because, you know, some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, you know, we're doing the history of Latin America 1810 to 1830, but what happened to China 1810 to 1830, or Japan, or any other part of the world? I mean, the idea is not to really do a chronological history of every portion of the world, because that's going to take 5 lifetimes to do. But rather here is to that, all right, so what we had is we had a French Revolution, we had a Haitian Revolution. I told you what the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution was. But we broadly want to get a sense of what is happening in the Americas. And that's going to be important in part because, of course, if you're thinking about the modern world, what we're also have to think about is the emergence, eventually, of the United States. Right? Emergence of the United States. There are historians who have devoted an entire lifetime to just studying the American Civil War. You know, I don't have the remotest interest in any of the military battles, actually, that took place in the American Civil War, and we're not even going to really look at the trajectory of this war from 1861 to 65, where you can find 1 million books on it. But I'm only interested in 2 or 3 of those repercussions, because, of course, you could say that the whole preservation of the Union, which is, if you had to, at least from the standpoint of American history, not necessarily from the standpoint of history everywhere else in the world, but at least from the standpoint of American history, that was the one unadulterated good, some people would say, that came out of the Civil War, the preservation of the Union, which is what Lincoln really fought for. But that so-called unadulterated good, or the one thing that most people agree, well, yes, you know, we did need the preservation of the Union. In retrospect, it seems that way. But now when you look at the discussion in the contemporary United States, you know, the division between the blue states and the red states, I don't know how many of you remember and how many of you keep up with this sort of thing, but immediately after the election of Mr. Trump, there were calls in California for secession of California. In Silicon Valley, there's a movement. Of course, nothing's going to come of it. You can be quite certain about that. Absolutely nothing's going to come of it. But there was already a call in Silicon Valley for California seceding from the Union. Right? The implication is that this tension must always be kept in mind. And this is what takes us back, because what is another way of speaking about this is secession. This is secession from what? From Spain. That's what it is. These are wars of secession from the point of view of the empire. They're wars of independence from the point of view of those who are struggling to achieve a degree of autonomy, but from the point of view of the empire, they're wars of secession. You know? And this is what, of course, you know, they say that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. You've heard of that cliche, right? Well, but whenever you see that cliche, we have to try to get behind what's the cliche. And of course, what's behind the cliche is the whole question of perspective. What is a perspective from which one views a certain thing? And are all perspectives equal? I mean, there is in philosophical circles and in post-colonial thought, there's a lot of discussion about these things. You know, how do we weigh how do we give a relative assessment to each position, right? Because it seems to me clearly that we cannot advocate the view that all interpretations are equally good or equally compelling. They're not. Some interpretations are more compelling than others, and that may or may not be because of evidence. Historians would like to believe that the evidentiary nature of these interpretations is what decides which interpretations are compelling and which are not. And that's something I strongly disagree with. And that is what so I'm giving you different ways to get into all of these texts. That's what the true you're reading about the unthinkable is about. Because what is that? It's an interpretation. He says that you look at these French writers, these great Enlightenment thinkers, and frankly, it's miserable. They're not even able to think about the autonomy of the black person. Right? But it's not as though you can summon 500 different quotes from Voltaire or Diderot or anyone else and say, all of these show exactly what these people were really thinking. You can summon a few, but yes, we can do the work of interpretation, right? And so, again, because I want you to really think about why is it that we are doing these revolutions in Latin America. I mean, as I said, we could be doing the history of some other part of the world at this point in time. Because when we're really moving up to the United States, where what we're talking about is a war of secession, which is what indeed it was called. And if you read the inaugural addresses, so I gave you the inaugural addresses of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, right? Which have to be really read together, because Jefferson Davis is going to make a very interesting argument there, and that argument is going to be, and it seems to be unimpeachably true at some level, the argument is going to be what? That just as the American colonies broke away from the mother country, right, and rebelled against King George, right, similarly we are breaking away. Why shouldn't we have the right to do that? Right? Don't we have the autonomy to do this? And that is, if you think about it, really the claim that he's going to be making in this particular address that you have. I'll come back to these Latin American revolutions, but I'm just giving you a slice of how you might want to start thinking about some of these things, right? And so here I quote, here he says, our present condition, this is from the inaugural address of Jefferson Davis, our present condition achieved in a manner unprecedented in the history of nations illustrates the American idea. The American idea, what we, the southern states, the Confederate states are doing is very American, right? Illustrates the American idea that governments rest upon the consent of the governed. Now the Union no longer has our consent. So what is the difficulty? And I'm saying that, there is a kind of a liberal standpoint, or I would say even broader standpoint in the US, which has now accepted the standard narrative about the Civil War. It was meant for the preservation of the Union, but again, there are serious questions. Why is the preservation of the Union an unadulterated good, something to be achieved for? And why is it that Jefferson Davis's argument is not a plausible argument, which the assumption seems to be that it no longer is? Is it simply because he was on the losing side of the Civil War, right? And you could say, of course, well, we can complicate it because, of course, he stood for slavery, right? The Confederate States stood for slavery, so this was a battle of good over evil. Right? Now, that seems to put it in a cosmic theological sense, and of course, what did the northern states stand for? It's not as though black men had unadulterated rights to freedom and black women had unadulterated rights to freedom in the North. Not at all. Right? And if you read Lincoln's first inaugural address, he makes it starkly clear that he is not fighting this war to signal his opposition to slavery. He makes it absolutely clear, unequivocally clear, right? Let me finish the Jefferson Davis, turn to Lincoln, and then we go back to this, right? So our present condition, says Jefferson Davis, illustrates the American idea that governments rest upon the consent of the governed, and that it is a right of the people to alter or abolish governments whenever they become destructive of the ends for which they are established. Something that Lincoln could not have disagreed with, something that no liberal could indeed have disagreed with. And then if we turn to Lincoln, he says, I have no purpose. I'm quoting him. I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I mean, this does not call for, multiple interpretations. It is unequivocally an affirmation of the fact that at this juncture, he is not going to enter into a war with the southern states, with the secessionist states, because these states support slavery. Right? I believe I have no lawful right to do so. And I have no inclination to do so. End quote. And he further declares that we denounce the lawless invasion by armed forces of the soil of any state or territory, no matter what pretext, as among the gravest of crimes. And if you read the text, you know that just a few paragraphs further down, he says very clearly that in fact, this whole idea that the North has some kind of moral obligation to make sure that fugitive slaves get refuge and all of that he doesn't actually support this idea. All right. So, in order to understand, I think, all of this, we don't just need American history. We also need to turn to what's happening in Latin America, early part of the 19th century, right? And this rough map over here, this rough map, shows you, so Brazil is, of course, a Portuguese colony here, okay? And then, the rest of these were this, and this is what used to be called Gran Colombia, which existed only for about roughly 10 years. Simon Bolivar became, so he is a great figure of liberation. Just a little footnote. Again, these are things that you might think is an aside, but when I was growing up, in our generation, I think this generation, no one does that, but in our generation, there were people who used to collect postage stamps. Stamp collecting was a big thing. It's called philately, all right? Nowadays, I mean, my children don't even know what a postage stamp looks like, frankly, actually, I think, because the only communication they've had is by email. So we used to collect postage stamps, and I had an enormous collection because my father was a diplomat, so he used to get letters from all over the world, and I lived all over the world, literally, in my childhood. And the United States in the 1960s published 2 stamps called Champions of Liberty. And there were only 2 people in that series. Simon Bolivar, which is when I first heard of him, when I was 10 years old because I saw that stamp, and Mahatma Gandhi. Think about it, right? Because again, it tells you how a country thinks about other countries and why these people, were icons in some ways. Okay, in the 1960s was, of course, also the time when you had the civil rights movement in the United States. That might explain, in part, why these 2 people were, right? But Simon Bolivar, because, of course, we're speaking about a broadly, contiguous area. It's all in the Americas, at least, right? So he was a great champion of liberty there, and the leader of Gran Colombia. But then in 1830, and that's why you see 1830 here, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Venezuela is in the news every day nowadays because of demonstrations going on. The 3 again split and became independent, nations, right? But broadly speaking, what is it that we really need to know about Latin America in these wars of independence? That all of Latin America was wrested from Spain by the sword, with the exception of Brazil, which we'll turn to shortly. They had always been in the shadow of foreign intervention, of course, that when an empire is under threat of losing its colonies, it will try to send in a force to secure them. If it loses them, it will try to recolonize them. We're going to see constant attempts. We're not going to be able to actually study those, but we're going to see constant attempts by Spain to reclaim its lost possessions in this part of the world, in Mexico, all the way until the 1840s, 1850s, moving even into the 1860s, because one of the interesting things about the American Civil War is that unlike most wars of that magnitude, there was virtually no foreign intervention. This is one war where Britain and France did not attempt to try to influence the course of things. The most that you can say that happened was that that France attempted to actually aid Mexico in establishing a kind of a Franco-Mexican empire, which didn't last at all, right? But that's one of the singularities of the American Civil War, that this is really actually a war where there is almost no foreign intervention. A war of that magnitude, that's very rare, all right? But I'm saying in general, if you turn to this here, you see that the shadow of foreign intervention has been there. Colonial traditions had left virtually nothing behind with respect to such things as participatory government. The notion that people should be able to participate in their own governance, this was an idea that really was not tolerated by Spain or by Portugal in their possessions in Latin America. And what you really had was you had a highly centralized state which interfered in many aspects of life and created a dependence on central authority and also a resentment against it. When there's too much of a dependence on central authority, it also festers a resentment against that very central authority. And that's one of the things that you're seeing happening in places like Iraq, for example, in the last 20, 30 years, because of course Saddam Hussein had bottled it up, right? And there was virtually, dissent was very difficult, but it also breeded certain kinds of, resentment, right? So now if you, and incidentally, just to give you a sense of the, I gave you a demographic sort of breakdown of, okay, who the Creoles are, who are the mulattoes, who are the mestizos. The population of Latin America, circa 1810, is only about 20 million. Okay, I mean, so I just want you to keep that in mind. Now these wars of independence, what are the general factors that one can think about? So general factors are certainly the American Revolution. The example of the American Revolution was in mind. Now, there's a very interesting book to be written. I'm not going to write it, maybe somebody else will. There's a very interesting book to be written about how the American Declaration of Independence has been appropriated by people in different parts of the world who have been fighting for independence. Right? Which portions of it have they used, which portions have they not used? But I think that if you turn to the writings of, for example, someone like Simon Bolivar, you see that he was intimately familiar with the writings produced in those days, which would include such things as the Federalist Papers, for example. Okay, not just the Declaration of Independence, but the Federalist Papers, many of the pamphlets that went flying back and forth, because these wars were very often fought with pamphlets, which is again an extraordinarily interesting subject in its own right. The use of pamphlets and their increasing use in the late 18th century, 19th century print media, right? That is a predominant form of print media in the 19th century, newspapers and pamphlets, all right? So there's a presence of the American Revolution, or the example of the American Revolution, the example of the French Revolution, which becomes unacceptable to the Creoles, that is white people born in these Americas, because it involved the concept of regicide. Regicide is the killing of kings, right? So that's what you had in France when Louis was guillotined and Marie Antoinette. That's regicide. And of course the idea of social leveling, which was entailed by the French Revolution. All of this was really unacceptable to the Creoles. So the initial phase of the French Revolution seemed fine to these Creoles over here in Latin America, but the radical phase of the French Revolution is something that really frightened them. The rejection of the church's authority, right? This was also an important factor. And of course here we're speaking about the Catholic Church. And then to add another element to what might have been some of the things that contributed to these wars of independence, you have the example, of course, of the Haitian Revolution. And finally, to this list, I would add the fact that there was a considerable confusion in the Iberian Peninsula, by which I mean back in Spain and Portugal. There was a lot of political confusion, which actually it has a bearing on what happens in Latin America. Let's turn for a second to Europe. First decade of the 1800s. Napoleon invades Spain in 1808. Right? So when he invades Spain, one of the short-term consequences over the course of the next 10, 15 years is that Spain's authority in Latin America is going to get eroded. partially because, of course, the Spanish are not able to send in the kinds of troops and reinforcements that they hoped that they would be able to. And what's going to happen is, on the other hand, is that the Creoles, that is the Creole elites, who had always been hankering for some degree of independence from the metropolitan capital, right? That's a very familiar scenario in every colonial context, right? One of the exceptions to that, of course, is in some ways the English elites in India, who never really thought that, well, what we're really going to do is we're going to create a separate empire for ourselves. Although de facto, in some ways, they did. And why? Why? Because in the early 19th century, all the way until 1850s, an English official in India takes a decision. It is going to be 2 years before someone in London weighs in, sends back a letter and says the decision you've taken is wrong, by which time that guy might be dead. You know, people don't think about it. If you are an English official in India, you're what I call the man on the spot. You're the man on the spot. You know best because you're there, right? So how should you handle a rebellion? So you seek advice, guidance from officers back in London. Well, the problem is it takes a minimum of 6 months for a letter to get from Delhi to London, or from Calcutta to London. Minimum of 6 months. Then it's going to go through the bureaucratic mill in London. And by the time a letter gets back, that's what I meant, it may be 2 years. By which time we've moved on to 5 other rebellions, or the people in charge of that, they've scattered, right? So effectively they were creating an empire in that sense. That many of the English officials in places like India, said, well, we don't really care what our superiors in London say, because how are they really going to check our authority? Right? That was always a factor. But here we're speaking about something different. Right? Because there it was simply that, well, there may be areas when we're going to exercise our jurisdiction, no one can really control us. Here there is a real hankering among the white elites, the Creoles, that we really want to break away from Spain. We want to set up our own autonomous empire over here, not be responsible to Spain. And one of the reasons you don't want to be responsible to Spain or Portugal is because whatever profits you're making over here, whatever theft you're engaging in, loot you're engaging in here, you always have to send a portion of it back to Spain. Well, if you didn't have to do that, it would be a lot better, right? So the Creole elites are hankering for a certain kind of independence, but there's always a tension, there's always an ambiguity. And that ambiguity is that, well, what if things get out of hand? Because if you're going to overthrow the imperial power, and you're going to enlist the aid of the mestizos or the mulattoes or both, what if these mestizos and mulattoes cannot be controlled by you? Right? This was always a factor in the history of these revolutions and how they turned out. Okay? And I'm not giving you all the details of the confusion in the Iberian, peninsula, where Napoleon is actually going to place his brother, on the throne, and the Spanish elites back in Spain are not going to accept it, so they're actually going to establish a junta central, that is a central committee, which is going to rule in opposition to the king. This is all between 1808 and 1810, and then in 1810 is when the first rebellions break out in Latin America. All right, and of course the main revolutionary leaders. Let me just quickly turn to this slide here. So in the north you have Simon Bolivar. I'm going to say a little bit about him very briefly. In the south you have Jose de San Martin of Argentina. Now Bolivar is unquestionably the commanding figure in Latin American public life from 1810 to 1830, without any question. He comes from a wealthy Creole family. So in other words, his forefathers are born, they're Creoles, so they're born in Latin America, they're not born in Spain. He's an army officer in Venezuela, right, in Venezuela. It is in 1810 that he is going to be able to, he's going to capture Caracas and assert Venezuelan independence. The details of all of this, again, are very murky because it goes back and forth. He's successful a couple of years, and again, the imperial forces are able to regain control. The gist of it is that he's actually going to be exiled in 1814 And the reading that you have, the letter from Jamaica, which is written in exile in September 1815, what does he do there? Among other things, he takes a vow that he's going to end the political suppression and economic servitude in Venezuela. And there are a couple of passages that I just want to very briefly look at, very briefly, okay, from this letter. He says the hatred that the peninsula, so what is he referring here to? He's referring to the Iberian Peninsula. He's referring to Spain, okay? The hatred that the peninsula has inspired in us is greater than the ocean between us. And there's an ocean that separates us, but the hatred is greater. Right? So you can see that the tension between these Creole elites here and obviously the commanding elites in Spain itself. It would be easier to have the two continents meet. I mean, this is really remarkable, you know, because he's saying there's no possibility of negotiation, no possibility for discussion. The rift is too great between us and Spain. Right? It would be easier to have the two continents meet than to reconcile the spirits of the two countries. The habit of obedience, a community of interest, of understanding, of religion, mutual goodwill, a tender regard for the birthplace, and a good name of our forefathers. In short, all that gave rise to our hopes came to us from Spain. So everything that is good within us came from there, but nevertheless, this huge rift really developed, right? As a result, there was born principle of affinity that seemed eternal. It seemed that the bond would be eternal between us, notwithstanding the misbehavior of our rulers. Here's the first sign now. There was this bond that was eternal between us and the elites back in Spain. That's the mother country. But the misbehavior of our rulers, which weakened that sympathy, or rather that bond enforced by the domination of their rule. Right? So now you're going to have to read very carefully, because he begins to use words such as domination of their rule. And at present, the contrary attitude persists. Something has changed over a period of time. We are threatened with the fear of death, dishonor, and every harm. There is nothing that we have not suffered at the hands of that unnatural stepmother, Spain. Okay, I don't know what the Spanish is that is used here, but of course his use of the figure of the stepmother, right? The stepmother is always a wicked one, right? Remember in all the folk tales and so forth and so on. Right? So this is, you know, just this passage itself tells you how far apart the Creoles had come from the mother country, right? Now, just to go back to Simon Bolivar, so you know he writes this letter. He's going to eventually come back. He gets help from Haiti and Britain. So Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, had made it possible, in part, for Haiti to become something of a force in the politics of that region, at least at that juncture. Defeats the Spanish forces in 1819, and then establishes what is called Grand Colombia, right? So this Grand Colombia lasts from roughly around 1821 to 1830, and then these three countries are going to go separate ways, become three, you know, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia. If you go further down south to Latin America, so you have San Jose de San Martin of Argentina. For a time, he and Simon Bolivar actually collaborated. Argentina had declared its independence in 1816. The two of them actually meet in Ecuador in 1822. And at that point in time, you can think about a twin-pronged movement in Latin America. So you have Jose de San Martin, and then you have Simon Bolivar. Jose de San Martin is actually eventually going to go to France in a couple of years, and Simon Bolivar is going to be left in charge of the freedom movements in Latin America. Right? So that's roughly the story that takes us up to about roughly around 1830, you know, around that time. All right, which is when, as I said, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela become separate nations. I'm going to turn briefly to Brazil. So let's just go back to that slide so you can see once again over here. So Brazil over here, Portuguese colony. Because the history of Brazil here is very, very different in some respects. It's very different because it's a very unusual situation. In fact, almost unprecedented. Unprecedented because, owing to circumstances in the Iberian Peninsula, which have to do with the Napoleonic Wars of the first decade, which I've already mentioned. Remember that Napoleon invades Spain in 1808. Owing to the Napoleonic Wars and the political turbulence, what's going to happen is that the king of Portugal is actually going to exile himself to the colony. So the Portuguese Empire, including the central authority in Portugal itself, is all going to be based in Rio. Right? I mean, and that's really an unprecedented situation where we are saying that it's the colony which is now kind of running the metropole, right? But this is only going to be, of course, for a few years. And what effectively another way of saying it is that Brazil is going to become the center of the Portuguese Empire. It's not Portugal itself which is at center. It is Brazil. And there's going to be a number of reforms that are going to be administered because once the capital of Portugal effectively moves to the colony itself, what this means is that some of the kinds of reforms that you had, which had been undertaken in Portugal, were now going to be undertaken in Brazil itself. And these included reforms in administration, schooling, manufacturing, agriculture. When we say schooling and administration, what we're talking about is a greater centralization and the fact that schooling was actually going to be made widely available. When I say widely, again, it's a relative term, right? Because it doesn't mean that there's universal schooling. There's no country in the world where you have universal schooling at this point in time. The Portuguese king is going to return to Lisbon in 1821. He leaves behind his son, Pedro, who then decides that he's going to declare independence from his father. Right? And so he's actually going to now launch the independent Republic of Brazil in 1822. And Brazil is going to become a constitutional monarchy, which is what it's going to remain until the late 19th century. But one way in which Brazil is going to be different is that it is going to have a kind of political stability through much of the 19th century, which most of Latin America did not have. Okay, so again, this is a very capsule history here that I'm giving you of Brazil, and what I'm pointing to is the fact that the phenomenon that you encounter here is really quite unprecedented because Portugal, so to speak, has moved to Brazil itself, and this is where the Portuguese Empire is now going to be based. All right, now we're going to turn to North America, but before we do that, we have very briefly, Mexico that we need to think about. Okay, because one of the things that we have to think about is that we haven't really looked at the history of North America. We talked very briefly about the American Revolution, and of course I've often referred to the U.S., very often contemporary U.S. In passing in many of my lectures, but we really haven't seen what is going to happen in the United States. After the Declaration of Independence and the passage of the Constitution. The chapter of the history that we're really interested in, which takes us to the Civil War, is obviously what happens in Mexico, in the adjoining area. This, by the way, is a contemporary painting of Simon Bolivar. And I want you to look at this map over here. This is a map which, this is the original American colonies on the seaboard. This all is the United States here now. This is Florida, which at this point, I'm here talking about the early 1840s, is not an American possession at this point in time. This is Oregon over here. Over here. And this is, you know what this is, right? This is Texas. This is Texas, okay? And this is the portion of the West Coast that was going to be ceded by Mexico when it lost the war of 1846, 1848, all right? So we've got Oregon here, this is the portion ceded by Mexico. So this map is post-1848 because it shows you the portion that is now ceded by Mexico. It's not post 1848 in the sense that, because of course then it would all be part of the United States, but essentially what is going to become post 1848, right? The map is drawn earlier, but it shows you what is going to become eventually the state of this North America post 1848, and this is Texas here. And some of you might recall from your reading of American history that Texas was actually independent for about a dozen years, roughly around a dozen years. So a convoluted history, and much of the contemporary discussion sometimes when we see in Texas refers to this time, because as you know, Texas is a world unto itself in all kinds of different ways. Much of it unsavory, but we don't need to get into that. It's a world unto its own, and this particular history is something which has bearing on how we think about the United States today. But fundamentally, for our purposes, what we're really interested in is the fact that Texas is going to be annexed, and then eventually this portion further to the west here is going to be ceded to the United States. Now, the implication, of course, is that what you have is, and this was not the case with Australia at this point in time, because Australia would be the other illustration of a continent where from coast to coast, right, it all becomes one country, right? But this is really the first time this is happening here. So from the East Coast to the Pacific Coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, it's all going to become the United States. And of course, you could say that, look, I mean, what is going to eventually become the dominance of the United States partly has to do with geographical factors. It has to do with the fact that you have an entire continent which is a single country, and that the entire span of this country, from coast to coast, is such that it is going to really overwhelm any other factor that we could think of. There used to be an American historian who wrote a fantastic book. His name is David Potter. This book was written in the 1950s, and the book is called People of Plenty. People of Plenty. And the simple proposition that he had was that he said that Americans have long been persuaded that it was their idea of revolution that effectively revolutionized the world. But he said no, what really revolutionized the world was the idea that you could have abundance, that that the world had never witnessed the kind of abundance that the United States would stand for. This was really what was unprecedented in history. And one of the slides I'm going to show you when we get to the 1950s is a photograph that somebody took, and they said, just imagine if you put together everything that a family ate in 1 year, okay? So let's say a family of 4, how many cans of tomato sauce? And back in the 1950s, canned goods were a lot more common than they are today, a lot more common. People ate out of canned goods, Spam, for example, the sort of things that, you're not supposed to eat today. And so, when you see this photograph, I mean, it's really astonishing because, it's like a mountain of food, covering a huge room. Well, and they said this is roughly what we guess one family consumes in America, a family of 4 in 1 year. It was this abundance. The abundance began when you could span both the oceans, which really, as I said, is something to think about, right? And the Mexican-American War is very interesting because, of course, the Mexican perspective on this was very different than the American perspective. And there is no question that things like annexation and occupation are a part of how the United States became eventually the United States. And for example, Austin, one of the major cities, of course, and the capital in Texas, that Austin is named after one of the many hundreds of Americans who went and occupied that portion of Texas, which was, of course, Mexican territory, right? And then eventually it's going to be annexed, right? So that's the course of events that we're really talking about. However, all of this is really a prelude to what we're fundamentally interested in now. And what we're fundamentally interested in is now the American Civil War. And as I pointed out to you, we're not, going to visit the whole history of this war. What I'm interested in is just a number of implications and repercussions that we have to think about when we think about the American Civil War. The death toll in the American Civil War was 600,000. Now 600,000, does anybody want to make a guess what was the population of the United States in 1865? What do you think it might have been? I mean, the population of the United States today is about 340 million, roughly. Okay, so quick guess by anyone? How much? 30. Okay, not too far off, 40, roughly. That's okay. You don't really have a full-fledged census, but there were demographic studies, and so yes, the population was roughly 40 million, and 600,000 dead out of a population of 40 million is a considerable casualty figure. Okay, of course, we have instances such as Syria today, where if you count the number of people who've been killed in the civil war, and I want you to think about that phrase "civil war." All right, I really want you to think about it, because we'd have to ask whether today's civil wars are really civil wars. A civil war usually means a war that is fought between different factions within a country. And we know that there is no war in the Middle East which is strictly a civil war, because there are geopolitical factors weighing in. If you look at Syria, there's, Turkey is a factor, Iran is a factor, the US is a factor, obviously Russia is a factor, not to mention neighboring countries in the Middle East, right? However, if you turn back to this, as I pointed out, one of the singularities of the American Civil War is the fact that we really don't have any foreign intervention, but you do have what for those times was a fairly high casualty rate, 600,000 out of 40 million. One of the reasons you had a high casualty rate is that the American Civil War is really the first instance of mechanized slaughter. Okay, I'm not using the word industrial slaughter. We're going to have to wait until we get to the end of the century, early part of the 20th century, World War I, before you get to really industrialized slaughter, right? And I think that, even these phrases should immediately alert you to the fact that I'm questioning this glorious narrative of progress that most of us have grown up on. That as we move along in time, we become wiser, more progressive, that there's, Steven Pinker at Harvard University has argued, I think it's a completely erroneous argument, that there's much less killing now than there used to be, in previous generations. We have become much more nonviolent, so forth and so on. But what's interesting is precisely how we move from different kinds of slaughter, and of course military technology has a lot to do with that as well, right? And when I say mechanized slaughter, what I'm really talking about is, for example, the use of cannons aimed directly at cities. So, think of what happened to Atlanta, the burning of Atlanta by Sherman, for example, right? Where essentially some early concept of total war is very much prevalent. Because one of the conceptions in total war that you have to think about, and I think to some degree we saw that in the American Civil War, is that civilians cannot claim immunity. Now, of course, we have international safeguards today in principle, only in principle, that civilians should be able to claim immunity. They should not be touched. And you know that every time the U.S. bombs Syria or something, they always issue the Defense Department, Pentagon will always issue a statement saying that, we try to preserve the sanctity of civilian life, so forth and so on. And yet, of course, civilian loss of life is all collateral damage, right? The phrase that is used almost mechanically now. All of this, I'm saying the history of this in some sense goes back to the American Civil War, where you really had mechanized slaughter for the first time. So heavy bombardment, heavy guns, and something that I just want to mention, cameras for the first time that are available to capture a war firsthand. Photography, right? So we do have photographs. We don't really have photographs of wars before that. Indian Rebellion of 1857-58, you get a tad bit of that. But in the American Civil War, you get fairly widespread use of cameras to record the suffering and also to stimulate patriotism. Cameras are not just recording, they're not just simply observing. They are doing some work, and in this case, they're also stimulating patriotism. And one further aspect of this, all in the connection of sort of what you might describe as the technological changes that occur as a consequence of the war, a huge increase of small arms. So the widespread use of small arms, which has remained a major problem in many countries. All right. The second thing, of course, the preservation of the Union, right? Because what are we doing here? We're simply saying, well, let us consider some aspects of it. Now, I've already spoken to the preservation of the Union when I was quoting to you Lincoln, was suggesting to you that, in fact, actually, at least at the time of the first inaugural address, things are going to change when we get to the Emancipation Proclamation a couple of years later. But at least at the time of the first inaugural address in 1861, Lincoln is unequivocally clear that all he's really interested in is the preservation of the Union, and not in waging a war against the Confederate States because of their support of slavery. And this is intended to not to just to necessarily to puncture the kind of standard received narrative about the great heroic figure of Lincoln, but to suggest that there is obviously a kind of pragmatism about Lincoln as well, as there is about all of these figures, that Lincoln is very much aware at this point in time that perhaps he doesn't really have either, if I may put it, the tools or even the spiritual authority to be able to stipulate that, look, I'm fighting this war because I'm fundamentally interested in the abolition of slavery. I mean, this tension is going to remain. And if you see, of course, what happens in the aftermath of the war, I think we can understand why there was this tension. Because what would happen in the aftermath of the war and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation and then the Constitutional Amendment is that slavery would be officially abolished. But the official abolition of slavery did not confer rights of citizenship on the ground. That is, as a real force in the lives of African Americans. Whether they have ever been conferred, that even down to the present day, is something that we can seriously actually ask in many ways. All right. But the preservation of the Union is obviously one fundamental aspect of the American Civil War that we need to think about. Then we have the formal abolition of slavery, and when we turn, which we will in the next lecture very briefly, to the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58, we're going to find that in the 1850s, 1860s, there were two facets of the British world economy, two. Both of them are going to crumble in the 1850s, 1860s. First, of course, and that's the American Civil War, is the system of plantation slavery. Right? That whatever the position of the African American in the United States, however deplorable it's going to continue to be, certainly there is going to be an end to the system of plantation slavery, which had emanated, of course, as an aspect of the British world economy. The second aspect of the British world economy that is going to disappear in the 1850s is the abolition of the East India Company. Right, when you have the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58, the abolition of the East India Company. Right? Now there are implications of all of this for, what happens in especially in places like Central America, because the defeat of the South, for example, is going to create a substantial commercial depression in Cuba. Why? Because, and we're going to see figures later on in the next lecture, because American exports of cotton and tobacco are going to resume. These exports were stalled during the period of the Civil War. The Cuban economy received a huge lift, but once the war ends, Cuba is once again going to go into a kind of a commercial depression. All right, so we're going to stop here. I'm not completely through with this, but we're pretty much done with it. A few more minutes on this, a little bit more on the Indian Rebellion. So roughly around one lecture behind.